Hello, everybody, and welcome to Horror Magic. We are here on Heart Over Ego Radio Podcast Network. You can find us on any major podcast app out there. We're a podcast dedicated to healing the shame and guilt associated with sex, and I'm your host, Jenny McDaniel. Each week I feature a rad spiritual warrior, and today my guest is Reverend Niki Kissell. And our guest is an amazing sexual educator. She's also an intimacy coach, a professional cuddler, birth doula, as well as priestess, Reiki Master, emotional release facilitator, and high priestess of the Temple of Divine Ecstasy. Her practice is based in St. Petersburg, Florida, and she lives with her 16-year-old son, James, and fiancé, Tom, and their furry family members, Sadie and Ripley. She has been guiding and helping people find their path towards healing for almost 20 years. Welcome, Niki. How are you?
I am doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Jenny.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and I'm so excited just to dive right into our topics. We had a few minutes before the show to discuss maybe some hot topics, and I thought that maybe we could start on the topic of how you got into sexual healing. Tell us a little bit about your journey there, if you will.
Sure, absolutely. Well, my first sort of entry into the healing world, as it is for many of us, was through Reiki. So I started doing that, and I was also a practicing pagan for many years, so I did healing work more in that sort of vein, and they came together. And that was a perfect introduction to a practice called Moksha Magic, OKSHA, MAGICK, so magic with a K. And that's exactly how that practice came about. The founders of Moksha Magic took Reiki and pagan magical practicing and said, well, hey, what if we could use these things with sex in a way that makes everybody feel comfortable, empowered, and produces really great results both in manifestation and healing work. And that was my introduction, and that's still a center of my practice, and that's been about 15 years that I've been doing that.
And you called it moksha.
Moksha, yep. Moksha is a Sanskrit word that is generally translated liberation, the most common translation. And so it's sort of a double entendre. So liberation from the cycle of birth, death, rebirth, but also liberation in the sense of letting go of the things that ourselves and society holds us back, the limitations we impose on ourselves, and that freedom and empowerment that orgasm brings. So sort of all of that together was the idea of associating moksha with the practice.
15 years. That's several years that you've been able to play with it. Would you say that it will take many more years to kind of wrap your head around the practice? Is it one of those practices where you just keep diving in deeper and deeper?
Yes or no. It's one of those that is very simple to learn, and there is an initiation involved, but it's a very simple, accessible, make it for everybody type thing. It's not one of those where you have to jump through all the hoops and go through all this hierarchy to be brought into the practice. But like you said, yes, absolutely. The longer I do it, the more power and beauty and fun surprises I find with it.
Excellent. And would you say that you were affected by and are maybe even still affected by some of the societal oppressions and repressions of sex? Is that kind of how you leaned into finding this? And if
yes.
so, did it help? Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yes, to both parts. I was raised Catholic. As are many people I know that have now moved in this direction. So yes, there was definitely some negative messages I received growing up about sex. And what was the second question? It was, has this helped? Yes.
Is it helped? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. I was not very long out of the Catholic Church. I had actually strongly considered being a nun not too many years before that. And the first time I witnessed the main ritual, the main rite that is involved, I was a little bit freaked out that I was not freaked out. It was just so beautiful, so peaceful, that I was immediately drawn to it, and I just never looked back.
It resonated with you big time.
It did. It absolutely resonated. It opened a whole new world, and started me down a path of discovering healing, sexuality, magic, power. It was kind of my gateway drug.
And then what kinds of topics did you kind of start digging at first, right when you turned into that space? Would you say that you started maybe studying chakras or some of the ancient sex prostitutes, or what did you get into first?
Well, I already was pretty familiar with the chakras from my Reiki practice. I had already been doing that for a little bit. And it's one of those, just like with Reiki, that if you know about the chakras, you can incorporate it into that practice, but it's not one of those required things that you have to know about. But yeah, I went back and learned about the sacred prostitutes that were present in many, many ancient cultures, and how the patriarchy, Christianity, and dominant cultures switched many of those societies from a very sex-affirming, positive, woman-affirming life view to having sex as something that is controlled. When sex is controlled, it's a way of having control over everything, because sex is so powerful when we're connected to our sexuality and to that sacred gift. We recognize our power of creation and our power over our own lives. And so if somebody can, the guy that founded Moksha Magic always says, whoever somehow convinced people that sex was bad and that sex should be controlled somehow was the greatest salesman in history. That was the greatest,
the biggest dupe.
Manipulation. Yes, exactly. And we've been recovering from it ever since.
We sure have. And part of the reason I started the podcast is to bring some awareness and to shine some lights into those dogmas and facades that just were, like you said, manipulations to control and to suppress. Let me ask you, I'm curious, in your studies and what you remember of them, and I'm sure it was many years ago when you studied this, but what did you learn about what the sacred prostitutes would do in the temples? Did you get into any of the studies of their, their rituals or their practices or what they would get into?
Not so much the rituals and practices, but one of my favorite things about this, and I'm really not sure if this applies to a particular period and place, but one of the primary roles of the sacred prostitute was to help men coming home from war to transition back into their families and communities. You know, the men coming home were so traumatized and you know, in such a state of aggression, disillusionment. They were not fit to behave themselves in the way they did when they had left within their communities and families. And so one of the roles of the sacred prostitute was to help them lay down the fear, the aggression, the trauma, you know, whatever they had brought back, take that away from them, honor them, bring them into a place of peace, and so that they could then be the loving members of society in their homes that they needed to be.
I love that. That is a wonderful acclimation space, because you see with shell shock, post-traumatic stress disorder, things of this nature, we bring back our warriors and expect them to be able to function in a typical society when they've seen bloodshed, war, bombs, God knows what they've seen. And I think that that is incredible, that that was one of their main functions, is to help acclimate our warriors.
Absolutely. And I really think that it would be wonderful if we found a way to make that applicable to today, because we certainly have those warriors, whether they're actually off fighting overseas or working in those same energies here. I think there is an absolutely healing space for that today.
And that brings me to one of my first questions, which was, do you feel like sex work should be legalized?
I absolutely do, for a number of reasons. I'm in favor of any sort of sex act between consenting adults. And the vast majority of sex work takes place between consenting adults, and can be a very positive thing for a number of reasons. So it would be a way of keeping both the sex worker and the client safer, and would take burden off the criminal justice system for, you know, prosecuting and holding and all those things, both who are not harming anybody. And yet many times the sex worker themselves, who may possibly be coming from a space of disadvantage, and, you know, it continues a cycle of, you know, of poverty and what's the word I'm looking for? Unequal power dynamics.
You know, I know it's a different industry, but let's just take a look at an industry that is legalizing, for example, the marijuana industry. What we're doing is we're taking money out of the black market, making it safer, taxing it, and using it for things that the society needs. Some states are legal, some aren't, some are in between. But either way, what we're seeing are some benefits. Like Colorado had so much money one year that they sent back their people, the population, some money from it. So I was like, oh, wow, this is another industry that can be taxed and regulated, whether you think that's a good idea or not. It definitely makes it a bit safer, I think, for, like you said, the worker as well as the purchaser. And I do think that it could really make it a lot safer. And also, I think that I'd imagine that there would be more regulations around getting STD tests, getting AIDS tests, getting things like this. So I think it would make it safer. Sex workers would not be afraid to come forward if they were assaulted, robbed, otherwise the victims of a crime. Those kinds of things are often not reported because they're afraid of being arrested themselves. Yep. And so, you know, there's various views on it. Some say make
prostitution legal, and then, you have the regulations of the taxes, but many others are just looking for the decriminalization, where because even in countries where prostitution is legal, it still has a lot of negative consequences for sex workers coming from a more financially disadvantaged place. There are a lot of things that are put in place that can still be problematic. And I'm not the best person to speak about all those specifics. But there's a difference between legalization and decriminalization of sex work. And there's some really just important distinctions that go along with that.
I like what you were hitting on there, where if a sex worker was assaulted or mistreated in any way, the idea that he or she would step forward to get some legal help is small, because they would have to probably answer questions that they didn't want to answer about what they were doing, why they were doing it, and what their job is and what have you.
Absolutely.
So that is a real important space to look at, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And tell us a little bit about a future course you're getting together and putting together. It's called Pussy Power. You want to talk about that a little bit?
It is called Pussy Power. It's one I've done before, and I'm looking forward to putting it together again. I've become so comfortable talking about sex, particularly, the sacred sexuality, the healing work, but just sex in general. I just love talking about it. I have lots of friends that I can talk about sex. But I've also encountered a lot of people that maybe feel comfortable with me, that might share some personal things or some guilt or shame that they have around their sexuality in some way, and they say, wow, it's so great to have somebody I can talk about this stuff. They don't have that outlet. They very often are even afraid to bring that topic up. And so this course, Pussy Power, I developed to help people that maybe were not as comfortable in that space, didn't know where to turn for this sort of support. My tagline is, if you're afraid to say the word pussy, this class is for you.
Clever.
And so I actually did have one woman the first time I taught this class that, there was a lot of shame around that word for her. It had been used in a very derogatory way. And so by the end, she was shouting pussy right along with the rest of us. We did some affirmations right at the end, and we were just sort of chanting pussy power, pussy power, pussy power.
Healing. And, so healing.
Yeah,
good for that throat chakra too, getting the word out, just liberating that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. And maybe sometime next year people could look for that, and if so, and maybe you have a general idea when to expect that. And then also, can you tell people how they can get a hold of you so they can keep in touch?
Sure. The best ways to keep in touch, my website is called circleoflightunlimited.com. And so that's where I post all my classes and upcoming events. There's a newsletter sign up on there, and I'm actually really lax about sending out my newsletter, so if you sign up, you will not be bombarded. I promise. And also Facebook, you can find me at Circle of Light Unlimited.
Excellent. And on our show page, we have the spelling of her name, and we'll also put the link to her page, or at least a link to her website there. Yeah, get in touch. She won't bombard you. She'll give you the information as you need it, and you can sign up for some Pussy Power Magic and Sex Magic courses that she'll probably be putting together in the future. She is quite a teacher, so I'm imagining this is the tip of the iceberg, and she'll be climbing in and getting deep. So the next topic I wanted to talk about was sex education. How important is it, and when should we start with children?
Oh, sex education is, so important. Mm-hmm. And I have kids, and I've got to say, I started on this journey when my kids were young. I have one grown out of the house and one still at home now. And I was not as good an educator to them as I wish I had been. But I did always answer their questions. I loved it. My daughter would give me openings and ask questions. And so she would be like my reminder that, oh, we need to talk about this stuff. And one of the first things that we can start teaching our kids is about consent, you know, in ways that are not necessarily sexual. I think there's been, very fortunately, some really good conversations just in the last few years about how we don't force our kids to hug and kiss grandma, or we don't continue to roughhouse or play with them or tickle when they don't want to, and in fact encourage them to practice their saying yes and no. Because that's certainly something that I've had to practice, is really voicing my yes and my no, and even understanding when I'm feeling yes or no. So if we start with our kids early on those sorts of things, they are far ahead of where I was.
Brilliant. And you think maybe even as old as like 3 and 4, just kind of start implementing it a bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, and then having talks about our bodies and how they feel, and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, I really do feel like it's so important. And I was in elementary and middle school in the late 80s and 90s, and we really didn't get a lot of information. There was a lot of unknowns, and in those unknowns, there was a lot of anxiety. Oh gosh, what if I get pregnant? And they don't, not really sure about how one gets pregnant, so we're worried it might happen to us because there's a lot of shame around young girls getting pregnant. So I just feel like if we educate the kids, age appropriate, they'll just start to have some more knowledge and awareness, which then will diminish the worries and the stress and the unknowns and the anxieties. So
absolutely.
So important. Yeah, we should. I was also growing up in Michigan, a little bit of a Bible belt. So, I think that they kind of sidestep that a little bit, but hopefully in the future it starts to be more mainstream.
And what I got when I was growing up was actually, looking back, I grew up in very rural Pennsylvania. So, yeah, in the mid to late 90s, we actually did talk about things like how to put on a condom. We talked more about STDs, bad, or, don't get pregnant. We had a don't get pregnant day where they brought it. I'm horrified at this now, where teen moms came in and said, don't do what I do. I guess an important message, but
not the fear-based reality space. That's
right.
Not the best place.
So, we can start talking about how we find our pleasure and ask for pleasure. That's something, for teenagers, can be appropriate for, what a clitoris is for, my goodness. Yeah.
And that segues into my next topic and question here, which is, I know you like to work a lot around bolstering and healing shame and guilt and trauma and pain around sexuality. You want to talk about that a little?
Yeah. And that's really where my passion lies. When I started learning how to heal the sexual trauma that I experienced, it affected my life in so many ways. And let's see, I just totally blanked. I told you, this is what I love. This is what I'm passionate about. I just blanked.
So you felt like very classic healer energy, where you had some trauma, you sought and found some healing, it worked for you, and then you were able to dispense it to some other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And what my one of my mentors, Freya and Anna, always told me was that shame cannot, oh my goodness, I'm really
it's easy to get heady on these podcasts because it's a very heady experience to be on the air. They call it the air for reasons because it feels very heady, so it happens all the time.
Oh, that makes sense. And I'm an Aquarius, so I'm always
all the air.
all the air. Anyway, what do we need to do with our shame? I can't find her words, but I got the key to unlocking shame is to stop hiding it. Mm-hmm. Because so very, very often, the things that we are most shamed about, the things that we keep hidden from everybody, including ourselves, the antidote to that is speaking it, is sharing it, is letting it be voiced, letting it be seen and heard. I mean, not to everybody. We need to be careful. Not everybody deserves to hear all that really vulnerable, deep heart-seated stuff. I mean, we have to pick and choose wisely who we share that with, which is an important lesson I needed to learn. But when we do have someone that can really hold our space and look at us with love and acceptance in their eyes and tell us, thank you, I love you even more, not less, for sharing that, that is one of the most deeply healing experiences we can ever have.
There's a really cool quote that says, people start to heal the moment they feel heard or seen or both.
Yes. Is that Brene Brown?
It might be.
That was Brene Brown. I adore her.
And I thought that was so special because I am a big, I guess, supporter of energy alchemy. And the way you alchemize a negative energy is to bring it to light so it can be transmuted. So we bring guilt, shame, stress, anxiety, fear, hate, all of them. We bring them to the table, admit that they're there, admit that it's part of being human, and also admit that we don't want that in us. And then we alchemize it into a lighter frequency.
Absolutely. But here's the thing. Thank you for bringing that up. That is absolutely true. Not only do we need to bring it to the table and acknowledge it, we need to experience and we have these emotions for a reason. And very often we are afraid of expressing anger or experiencing anger or that level of fear or grief or whatever it is. In order to let it go, we first have to let it out. And allow ourselves to feel that, because when we turn all those things off, when we store them on our bodies, shut them down, push them away, we are also shutting down and pushing away our joy, our sense of empowerment, our sense of peace. We do not fully access those things if we are not fully accessing those more uncomfortable emotions.
So much agreed there. And I often say healing is freedom. It's not just this kitschy thing that people are doing and say you need to do. But when you start to really get into the healing space, you get kickbacks, and that is freedom. Freedom from these energies that take up so much space and energy, like anxiety, fear, and stress. It's not a productive energy. It doesn't help us. It actually prays for what we don't want when we sit in worry space. And so it's wonderful that there's healers out there.
Hold it. Yeah, when we sit and hold it, I agree. But we also, as it comes up, need to find a way of giving it space. Maybe not particularly in that moment. So, yeah, when we sit in that space, of anxiety and sit in that loop and just worry about it, that's not beneficial. But if there's a fear coming up, and perhaps it keeps coming up again and again when we try to say, oh, no, I'm going to go in a different direction, that was a warning sign. That was a gift that we are being given to say, what do I need to pay attention to? What can I do with this? What needs to be honored?
Absolutely. And I often accompany energy alchemy technique training with the reminder that anxiety and fear and stress absolutely have a function. Back in the day, thousands of years ago, you might get a sense of stress or anxiety, and you might have a predator, a tiger, or a ledge that you could fall off of and die. So there is a functionality to fear, stress, anxiety, like you said very clearly and beautifully, that those are signs and warnings, so to speak, from your body. But if we sit with them for too long, our perception of when to use those can get skewed. So often I say, before anyone alchemizes energy, I'm like, if you have a sense of fear, look around the corner. Are you in danger? Are you in an unsafe space? Take a look. If you can satiate yourself that you are not in danger, then come back to that feeling and say, okay, now you're not a productive energy. I admit that you're human. I allow that you are there. I know you have a function, but I can't sit in you for too much longer, because then I start getting in that headspace and spinning around in circles in it. So I agree wholeheartedly, Niki, that absolutely there's a function with these feelings. There's they're real. They need to be there. There's a good reason for them to be there. But in my studies of over 20 years, I've noticed that a lot of the people with autoimmune disorders, i.e. fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, there's a bunch of them out there. I noticed that they burnt out one or all of those emotions. For example, the common story when I lived in Michigan and was doing body work for years and years, the common story I heard from women with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia was, well, they raised 4 kids by themselves with no help. They burnt out worry, stress, and anxiety, and their system was just like, wow, I can't sit with that. And then there's a dysfunction. Like you said, those feelings in our body do sit, if they're overused and overproduced, they'll sit in our body and often create another sign of our body will start giving us signals in the health field that there's some agitation or disorder or something. So all very interesting topics and very deep studies.
Well, in addition, I'm glad you brought up the autoimmune disorders. When I look even below that, very, very, very often, there is trauma, and very, very often sexual trauma. And it's not necessarily from overuse, but underuse. When we've just packed things down, it's shutting down. We've heard very often that depression is anger turned inward. This is something else that Freya taught me, was what she told me was depression is anger we don't feel we have the right to express.
Fascinating and interesting, yes.
Yeah, when I got in touch, when I released a lot of the anger that I held in my body due to the sexual trauma and other, very much smaller traumas in my life, I went off my depression meds. I cut my hypothyroid meds in half. That's another autoimmune disorder. And I'm still working on it. I'm still healing. There's still things, as active and as much work as I've done. We heal. These things are layers. Some people get really discouraged. They're like, oh, I did this one thing. I released that. It's healed. I'm done. Why is it coming back? And then they beat themselves up because they're like, did it not work? Did I do it wrong? And there's, well, no, those things work. That healed. You released that layer, yes. And then you went on, you did more stuff, you healed more. Now you're ready to release that next layer.
Yep. Healing is layered. There is no doubt. And it's a beautifully productive feeling, as well as the ease and grace that come along with it. Yes, once you heal something, there usually is down the line another layer, but you just get more deep into that healing and freedom. And
that's a great thing. It's
a
not
wonderful
a
thing.
failure. Yeah.
It's just like when people say, oh, I've been married before, it failed. I'm like, hey, you gave it a go. You tried. How else do you learn? There's no shame in
you learned and
trying.
You grew, and you're going to be
do it again
in your next
if you want.
relationship. Yep.
Absolutely. No loss, no foul, all learning. We come here to do many things. Above all is to learn and to experience. And we are getting close to the end of our show, and of course it always goes way too fast. Niki, I hope that you join us again in the future, and we can dive into some more topics to help bolster and shine light at the shame that is associated and clearly associated with sexuality. And maybe next time we can get into some of the psychology angles of how healing our sexual traumas and sexuality can ripple out into our society for a more healthy mental space for us. So we can maybe get into that. Yes, I appreciate you. Can you tell everyone one more time how they can get a hold of you?
Sure. circleoflightunlimited.com or Circle of Light on Facebook, or look for Reverend Niki Kissell, but that's way harder to spell.
And she is on our show page, so you can get the spelling. We appreciate everyone for showing up. This is Horror Magic. We're going to be coming on a couple times a month, bringing on amazing healers and teachers, and we are part of the Heart Over Ego Radio Network. Go ahead to any major podcast app and search Heart Over Ego Radio, and you will find a plethora of shows ranging from sexuality to spiritual healing to astrology, and we even have an astrology politics show. So we have a variety of things for your listening pleasure, top-notch healers, and I appreciate you all for showing up. And until next time, we will see you again.